The Cuban Missile Crisis stands as a pivotal moment in human history, a 13-day maelstrom that brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. This perilous confrontation not only tested the mettle of global leadership but also exposed the fault lines of a fragile international order. As we embark on this journey through the shadows of the past, the question echoes: what secrets lie hidden in the ashes of a crisis that could have ended it all? As we delve deeper into the labyrinth of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the autumn of 1962 unfolds like a ticking clock, each passing day heightening the stakes in a game of nuclear chicken. It was on October 14, 1962, that an American U-2 spy plane soaring over the Cuban countryside captured images that would change the course of history. The photographs, developed and analyzed with urgency, revealed the presence of Soviet nuclear-capable ballistic missiles in Cuba, merely 90 miles from American shores. This discovery was akin to tossing a lit match into a powder keg, igniting a chain reaction of diplomatic maneuvering, military posturing, and clandestine operations that would bring the world perilously close to the abyss. The news reached President John F. Kennedy on the morning of October 16th, as he was handed a memo detailing the U-2's findings. The revelation sent shockwaves through the corridors of power in Washington, prompting an emergency meeting of the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, known as ExComm. This gathering of Kennedy's closest advisors would become the epicenter of decision-making during the crisis, as they grappled with the implications of Soviet missiles in Cuba and debated the appropriate response. The room was filled with heavy hitters, including Secretary of State Dean Rusk, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, and CIA Director John McCone, each bringing their unique perspective to the table. As the discussions unfolded, the complexity of the situation became apparent. On one hand, the presence of Soviet missiles in Cuba represented a direct threat to American security, potentially altering the strategic balance of power in the Western Hemisphere. On the other hand, any military action against Cuba could provoke a Soviet response, potentially escalating into a global conflict. The ExComm debates were marked by intense disagreements, with some advocating for a naval quarantine of the island, while others pushed for airstrikes or even a full-scale invasion. These deliberations were not merely about policy. They were about the very fate of humanity, hanging precariously in the balance. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, Premier Nikita Khrushchev was navigating his own treacherous landscape. The decision to deploy missiles to Cuba had been motivated by a desire to protect the island from an American invasion and to counter the U.S. nuclear advantage. However, as the crisis deepened, Khrushchev found himself facing opposition from hardliners within his own government who questioned his handling of the situation. The Soviet leader was thus caught between the need to stand firm against American pressure and the risk of losing control of the situation entirely. As Khrushchev navigated the intricate web of Soviet politics, he became increasingly aware of the need to maintain a delicate balance between firmness and flexibility. On October 18, 1962, he received a letter from Fidel Castro, the Cuban leader, urging him to take a more resolute stance against the Americans. Castro's words were laced with a sense of urgency, as he warned Khrushchev that any signs of weakness could embolden the United States to launch a military invasion of the island. This letter would later become a pivotal document in the crisis, as it revealed the deep-seated fears and anxieties of the Cuban leadership. Meanwhile, in Washington, the ExComm debates continued to intensify, with Kennedy's advisors presenting him with a range of options for responding to the Soviet missiles. On October 20, 1962, the president met with his Joint Chiefs of Staff, who advocated for a military invasion of Cuba, arguing that it was the only way to ensure the removal of the Soviet missiles. However, Kennedy remained skeptical, recognizing that such an action could lead to a catastrophic war. He asked his generals to provide him with more detailed plans, including estimates of the potential casualties and the likelihood of success. As the military options were being weighed, a small group of ExComm members, led by Secretary of State Dean Rusk, began exploring the possibility of a diplomatic solution. They proposed that the United States offer to remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey in exchange for the Soviet Union's withdrawal of its missiles from Cuba. This idea, though tentative, marked a significant shift in the thinking of Kennedy's advisors as they started to consider the potential benefits of a negotiated settlement. On October 22, 1962, Kennedy delivered a televised address to the nation, revealing the presence of Soviet missiles in Cuba and announcing a naval quarantine of the island. The speech was a masterful blend of firmness and restraint, as Kennedy sought to convey the gravity of the situation while also avoiding any language that could be seen as provocative. As he spoke, American warships were already moving into position around Cuba, preparing to intercept any Soviet vessels that might attempt to breach the quarantine. In Moscow, Khrushchev watched Kennedy's speech with a mix of anger and concern. He realized that the Americans were determined to prevent any further Soviet shipments from reaching Cuba, and that the situation was rapidly escalating. On October 23, 1962, he convened an emergency meeting of the Soviet Presidium, where he presented his colleagues with a stark assessment of the crisis. The room was filled with tension, as the Soviet leaders grappled with the possibility of a war that could engulf not just Cuba, but the entire world. As Khrushchev presented his assessment to the Soviet Presidium on October 23, 1962, the room was filled with a sense of foreboding. The Soviet leaders were keenly aware that the situation was spiraling out of control, and that the consequences of miscalculation could be catastrophic. Khrushchev's own position was precarious, as hardliners within the government began to question his handling of the crisis. Andrei Gromyko, the Soviet foreign minister, argued that the United States was bluffing and that the Soviet Union should stand firm in its support for Cuba. However, others, such as Anastas Mikoyan, a veteran Politburo member, urged caution, warning that a war with the United States would be disastrous for the Soviet Union. As the debate raged on, Khrushchev received a message from Fidel Castro, who was growing increasingly anxious about the situation. Castro warned Khrushchev that the Americans were preparing to invade Cuba and that the Soviet Union must take immediate action to defend its socialist ally. Khrushchev was torn between his loyalty to Castro and his own desire to avoid a war with the United States. He knew that any further escalation could lead to a nuclear conflict, which would be disastrous for both superpowers. Meanwhile, in Washington, Kennedy's advisors were discussing the implications of the Soviet Union's response to the naval quarantine. The CIA reported that several Soviet ships were approaching the quarantine line, and that it was unclear whether they would attempt to breach the blockade. Kennedy's military leaders urged him to take a firm stance, arguing that any sign of weakness could embolden the Soviets. However, others, such as Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, cautioned against overreacting, warning that a miscalculation could lead to war. On October 24, 1962, the Soviet ship Marukla approached the quarantine line, sparking a tense standoff between American and Soviet vessels. The Marukla was carrying a cargo of bunker oil, which was not considered a strategic material, but its attempted breach of the blockade was seen as a test of American resolve. Kennedy's advisors debated whether to intercept the ship, with some arguing that it would be a provocation, while others saw it as an opportunity to demonstrate American determination. As the Marukla approached the quarantine line, the USS Essex, a U.S. Navy aircraft carrier, moved into position to intercept it. The Soviet ship slowed down and then stopped just short of the quarantine line, awaiting further instructions from Moscow. Khrushchev, who was monitoring the situation closely, ordered the Marukla to turn back, recognizing that a confrontation at sea could lead to unpredictable consequences. The standoff between the Marukla and the USS Essex marked a critical moment in the crisis, as both sides began to realize the gravity of the situation. Kennedy's advisors recognized that the Soviet Union was not going to back down easily. While Khrushchev's leadership faced growing criticism from hardliners within the Soviet government, the next 24 hours would be crucial, as the two superpowers navigated a treacherous landscape of diplomacy and military posturing, with the fate of the world hanging precariously in the balance. On October 25, 1962, the United Nations Security Council convened an emergency meeting to discuss the crisis. The Soviet Union's ambassador, Valerian Zorin, clashed with the U.S. ambassador, Adlai Stevenson, over the issue of the quarantine and the presence of Soviet missiles in Cuba. The debate was heated, with both sides presenting their arguments and accusing each other of aggression. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, Diplomats from both countries were exploring the possibility of a negotiated settlement, recognizing that a war would be disastrous for all parties involved. As the United Nations Security Council meeting adjourned on October 25, 1962, without a resolution, the diplomatic efforts behind the scenes gained momentum. In Washington, President Kennedy's advisor, Theodore Sorensen, drafted a letter to Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev outlining a possible compromise: the removal of Soviet missiles from Cuba in exchange for a U.S. promise not to invade the island and the dismantling of U.S. missile sites in Turkey. The letter was hand-delivered to the Soviet embassy by Attorney General Robert Kennedy, who met with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin to discuss the proposal. Meanwhile, in Moscow, Khrushchev convened an emergency meeting of the Presidium to consider the U.S. offer. The room was divided between hardliners, such as Marshal Rodion Malinowski and Leonid Brezhnev, who advocated for a tougher stance against the United States, and moderates like Andrei Gromyko and Anastas Mikoyan, who supported exploring the possibility of a negotiated settlement. Khrushchev, torn between his loyalty to Fidel Castro and the growing pressure from his own military leaders, ultimately decided to respond positively to the U.S. proposal. On October 26, 1962, Dobrynin handed Robert Kennedy a letter from Khrushchev, accepting the U.S. offer in principle, but with some conditions. The Soviet premier demanded that the United States publicly guarantee not to invade Cuba and withdraw its missile sites from Turkey within a specified time frame. As the two sides began to negotiate the details of the agreement, the atmosphere remained tense. In Cuba, Fidel Castro, unaware of the secret negotiations between the U.S. and the USSR, continued to prepare his military for an imminent invasion. As the day drew to a close on October 26, President Kennedy received a second letter from Khrushchev, this one more confrontational in tone. The Soviet premier warned that any U.S. attack on Cuba or Soviet ships would be met with full force, including nuclear retaliation. Kennedy's advisors were divided on how to respond, with some arguing that the letter was a bluff and others warning that it could be a genuine threat. As the president pondered his next move, the world held its breath, waiting to see if the crisis would escalate into a catastrophic war. In the early hours of October 27, 1962, a U-2 spy plane piloted by Major Rudolph Anderson, Jr. took off from McGuire Air Force Base in New Jersey, bound for Cuba. The mission was to gather photographic evidence of Soviet missile sites on the island, which would be crucial in verifying whether the USSR was complying with the terms of the proposed agreement. As Anderson's plane flew over Cuban airspace, it was detected by Soviet radar, and a surface-to-air missile was launched, shooting down the U-2 and killing the pilot. The incident sparked outrage in Washington, with many calling for immediate retaliation against the Soviet Union. As news of the downed U-2 reached Washington, President Kennedy's advisors convened an emergency meeting to discuss the implications of the incident. Secretary of State Dean Rusk, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, and Attorney General Robert Kennedy were among those who gathered in the Oval Office to consider the administration's response. The mood was tense, with some arguing that the Soviet Union's actions constituted a direct challenge to American authority and warranted a strong military response. Meanwhile, in Moscow, Premier Khrushchev was facing his own crisis management team, which included Defense Minister Rodion Malinowski, Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko, and Communist Party Secretary Leonid Brezhnev. The Soviet leadership was deeply concerned about the potential consequences of the U-2 incident, particularly given the fragile state of negotiations over the proposed agreement to resolve the crisis. As the day wore on, President Kennedy received a somber briefing from his military advisors, who presented him with a range of options for responding to the downed U-2. These included launching a retaliatory strike against Soviet air defenses in Cuba, escalating the naval quarantine, or even authorizing a full-scale invasion of the island. However, Kennedy was determined to avoid escalating the situation further, recognizing that such actions could lead to a catastrophic war. In a tense conversation with his brother Robert, the president expressed his deep concern about the U-2 incident and the potential for miscalculation on both sides. He instructed his brother to convey a message to Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin, emphasizing the need for restraint and reiterating the administration's commitment to finding a peaceful resolution to the crisis. As the evening drew to a close, Dobrynin received Robert Kennedy's message and immediately relayed it to Moscow. The Soviet leadership, still reeling from the U-2 incident, began to consider the implications of the American message. In a hastily convened meeting, Khrushchev and his advisors debated the merits of continuing to negotiate with the United States, weighing the potential benefits of a peaceful resolution against the risks of appearing weak or compromising Soviet interests. As the night wore on, the two superpowers remained locked in a delicate dance, each side seeking to navigate the treacherous landscape of diplomatic maneuvering and military posturing. The fate of the world hung precariously in the balance, as leaders on both sides struggled to find a way out of the crisis without resorting to war. In the early hours of October 28, 1962, President Kennedy received a message from Premier Khrushchev responding to the American proposal for a negotiated settlement. The Soviet leader accepted the basic terms of the agreement, including the removal of Soviet missiles from Cuba in exchange for a U.S. promise not to invade the island and the dismantling of U.S. missile sites in Turkey. However, Khrushchev also introduced a new condition, demanding that the United States publicly guarantee the security of Cuba and refrain from interfering in the island's internal affairs. As Premier Khrushchev's message reached Washington, President Kennedy convened an emergency meeting with his advisors to discuss the new Soviet condition. The meeting took place in the Oval Office, with Secretary of State Dean Rusk, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, and Attorney General Robert Kennedy in attendance. The president asked his advisors to carefully consider the implications of Khrushchev's demand for a public guarantee of Cuba's security and non-interference in its internal affairs. Rusk cautioned that such a guarantee could be perceived as a limitation on American sovereignty and might be opposed by Congress. McNamara, on the other hand, argued that the guarantee was essential to securing a peaceful resolution to the crisis and preventing a potential war. Robert Kennedy suggested that the administration could use diplomatic language to craft a response that would satisfy Khrushchev's concerns without compromising American interests. Meanwhile, in Moscow, Khrushchev was facing pressure from his own advisors to take a tougher stance against the United States. Soviet Defense Minister Rodion Malinowski and Communist Party Secretary Leonid Brezhnev were among those who argued that the USSR should not back down from its demands, even if it meant risking a confrontation with the Americans. However, Khrushchev remained committed to finding a peaceful solution, recognizing that a war over Cuba would have catastrophic consequences for both sides. As the day wore on, President Kennedy and his advisors continued to debate the best course of action. The president instructed his speechwriter, Theodore Sorensen, to draft a response to Khrushchev's message, one that would address the Soviet leader's concerns while also protecting American interests. Sorensen worked tirelessly to craft a diplomatic reply, carefully choosing words that would convey the administration's commitment to peace without appearing weak or compromising. In the evening, Kennedy met with his advisors again to review the draft response. After some discussion and revision, the president approved the final text, which was then transmitted to Moscow via the State Department's communication channels. The message acknowledged Khrushchev's concerns about Cuba's security and expressed a willingness to provide assurances on non-interference, while also reiterating the American demand for the removal of Soviet missiles from the island. As the message reached Moscow, Khrushchev and his advisors pored over the text, analyzing every word and phrase. The Soviet leader was pleased to see that Kennedy was willing to address his concerns about Cuba's security, but he remained skeptical about the American commitment to non-interference. After some deliberation, Khrushchev decided to respond with a message of his own, one that would accept the basic terms of the agreement while also seeking further clarification on certain points. As Khrushchev's response was being drafted, Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko and Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin were engaged in a flurry of diplomatic activity, meeting with American officials to discuss the finer points of the proposed agreement. In Washington, Secretary of State Dean Rusk and Attorney General Robert Kennedy were leading the negotiations on behalf of the United States, working tirelessly to ensure that American interests were protected while also finding common ground with their Soviet counterparts. Meanwhile, back in Moscow, Khrushchev was facing increasing pressure from hardline members of the Politburo, who were skeptical of his decision to compromise with the Americans. Soviet Defense Minister Rodion Malinowski and Communist Party Secretary Leonid Brezhnev were among those who argued that the USSR should not back down from its demands, even if it meant risking a confrontation with the United States. Despite these internal divisions, Khrushchev remained committed to finding a peaceful solution to the crisis. He recognized that a war over Cuba would have catastrophic consequences for both sides, and he was determined to avoid such an outcome at all costs. As he worked on his response to Kennedy's message, Khrushchev was keenly aware of the need to balance competing interests and priorities, both within his own government and in the wider international community. On October 28, 1962, Khrushchev's response was finally transmitted to Washington, where it was received with a mix of relief and caution. The Soviet leader accepted the basic terms of the agreement, including the removal of Soviet missiles from Cuba in exchange for a U.S. promise not to invade the island and the dismantling of U.S. missile sites in Turkey. However, Khrushchev also introduced some new conditions, seeking further assurances on the security of Cuba and the non-interference of the United States in its internal affairs. As Kennedy and his advisors pored over Khrushchev's response, they were heartened by the Soviet leader's willingness to compromise, but they were also aware of the need to proceed with caution. The president instructed his speechwriter, Theodore Sorensen, to draft a reply that would address Khrushchev's concerns while also protecting American interests. Sorensen worked closely with Secretary of State Rusk and Attorney General Kennedy to craft a response that would move the negotiations forward while avoiding any unnecessary concessions. In the midst of these delicate diplomatic maneuvers, the U.S. military was maintaining a state of high alert, ready to respond at a moment's notice in case the situation escalated. Admiral George Anderson, Chief of Naval Operations, was overseeing the naval blockade of Cuba, ensuring that no further Soviet ships attempted to reach the island with missile shipments on board. Meanwhile, General Curtis LeMay, Air Force Chief of Staff, was preparing contingency plans for a potential airstrike against Soviet military targets in Cuba, should diplomacy fail. As the negotiations continued, the world held its breath, waiting to see if Kennedy and Khrushchev could find a way out of the crisis without resorting to war. The stakes were high, with the fate of millions hanging precariously in the balance. Yet despite the tensions and uncertainties, there was a growing sense that a peaceful resolution might be within reach, provided that both sides could find the courage and wisdom to compromise and work together towards a common goal. In this atmosphere of heightened tension and cautious optimism, Kennedy and Khrushchev engaged in a series of delicate diplomatic exchanges, each seeking to probe the other's intentions and limitations. The Soviet leader was determined to protect Cuba's security and sovereignty, while the American president was equally resolved to defend U.S. interests and prevent the spread of communism in the Western Hemisphere. As the diplomatic exchanges between Kennedy and Khrushchev continued, a sense of cautious optimism began to emerge. On October 29, 1962, Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko met with U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Adlai Stevenson to discuss the proposed agreement. Gromyko reiterated the Soviet Union's commitment to removing its missiles from Cuba in exchange for a U.S. promise not to invade the island and the dismantling of U.S. missile sites in Turkey. However, he also emphasized the need for additional assurances regarding the security of Cuba and the non-interference of the United States in its internal affairs. Stevenson, aware of the delicate nature of the negotiations, carefully listened to Gromyko's concerns and responded with a measured tone. He acknowledged the Soviet Union's legitimate interests in protecting its socialist ally in Cuba, but also stressed the need for concrete actions to verify the removal of the missiles. The two diplomats engaged in a detailed discussion of the proposed agreement, exploring ways to address the concerns of both sides. Meanwhile, in Washington, Kennedy was meeting with his advisors to discuss the latest developments in the crisis. Attorney General Robert Kennedy, who had been playing a key role in the negotiations, briefed the president on the conversation between Gromyko and Stevenson. The president listened intently, weighing the pros and cons of the proposed agreement. He knew that any concessions made to the Soviet Union would be closely scrutinized by Congress and the American public, but he also recognized the urgent need to find a peaceful resolution to the crisis. As the meeting progressed, Secretary of State Dean Rusk suggested that the United States should seek additional assurances from the Soviet Union regarding the removal of its missiles from Cuba. He proposed that the U.S. demand on-site inspections of the missile sites to verify their dismantling and removal. Kennedy agreed, and instructions were sent to Ambassador Stevenson to convey this request to Gromyko. In Moscow, Khrushchev was facing increasing pressure from hardline members of the Politburo, who were skeptical of his decision to compromise with the Americans. Soviet Defense Minister Rodion Malinowski and Communist Party Secretary Leonid Brezhnev argued that the USSR should not back down from its demands, even if it meant risking a confrontation with the United States. Khrushchev, however, remained resolute in his commitment to finding a peaceful solution, recognizing that a war over Cuba would have catastrophic consequences for both sides. On October 30, 1962, Gromyko met again with Stevenson to discuss the U.S. request for on-site inspections of the missile sites. The Soviet foreign minister expressed concerns about the practicality and feasibility of such inspections, but agreed to consider the proposal. He suggested that the United Nations could play a role in verifying the removal of the missiles, an idea that Stevenson found intriguing. As the negotiations continued, the world remained on high alert, waiting anxiously for news of a breakthrough. The U.S. military maintained its state of readiness, with Admiral George Anderson's naval blockade of Cuba remaining in place. General Curtis LeMay's airstrike plans were still on the table, but there was a growing sense that diplomacy might yet prevail. In the midst of this tense and uncertain environment, Kennedy and Khrushchev engaged in a series of private letters, exchanging messages through secret channels. The two leaders sought to establish a personal connection, hoping to build trust and understanding between them. These letters, which would remain classified for decades, offered a glimpse into the private thoughts and motivations of the two men, revealing the depth of their commitment to finding a peaceful solution to the crisis. On October 31, 1962, Kennedy received a letter from Khrushchev in which the Soviet leader expressed his desire to find a mutually acceptable solution. Khrushchev wrote that he was willing to dismantle and remove the missiles from Cuba, provided that the United States would lift its naval blockade and promise not to invade the island. He also suggested that the two sides could work together to establish a framework for resolving future conflicts peacefully. Kennedy, heartened by Khrushchev's words, saw an opportunity to make progress. He responded with a letter of his own, outlining the terms of a proposed agreement and emphasizing the need for concrete actions to verify the removal of the missiles. The president also suggested that the two sides could explore ways to reduce tensions and improve relations in the future. As Kennedy's letter made its way to Khrushchev, the Soviet leader was engaged in a heated debate with his advisors over the terms of the proposed agreement. Soviet Defense Minister Rodion Malinowski and Communist Party Secretary Leonid Brezhnev continued to express their opposition to the deal, arguing that it would be seen as a sign of weakness by the United States and its allies. Khrushchev, however, remained resolute in his commitment to finding a peaceful solution, convinced that the consequences of a nuclear war would be catastrophic for both sides. On November 1, 1962, Khrushchev received Kennedy's letter and began to draft a response. He was determined to find a way to address the concerns of both parties, while also ensuring that the Soviet Union's interests were protected. As he worked on his reply, Khrushchev instructed his advisors to begin making preparations for the dismantling and removal of the missiles from Cuba. He also ordered the Soviet military to stand down, instructing them to refrain from any actions that could be seen as provocative by the United States. Meanwhile, in Washington, Kennedy was meeting with his advisors to discuss the latest developments in the crisis. Attorney General Robert Kennedy briefed the president on the contents of Khrushchev's letter, which had been intercepted by U.S. intelligence agents. The president listened intently, analyzing the language and tone used by the Soviet leader. He noted that Khrushchev seemed to be genuinely interested in finding a peaceful solution, but also appeared to be facing significant opposition from within his own government. As the meeting progressed, Secretary of State Dean Rusk suggested that the United States should consider making a public statement announcing its willingness to lift the naval blockade of Cuba in exchange for the Soviet Union's agreement to dismantle and remove the missiles. Kennedy agreed, and instructions were sent to U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Adlai Stevenson, to prepare a draft statement for presentation to the UN Security Council. On November 2, 1962, Stevenson presented the U.S. proposal to the UN Security Council, calling on the Soviet Union to dismantle and remove its missiles from Cuba in exchange for a U.S. pledge not to invade the island. The proposal was met with skepticism by the Soviet delegate, Valerian Zorin, who argued that the United States had no right to dictate terms to the Soviet Union or its allies. Despite the initial rejection, Stevenson continued to press for a resolution, engaging in intense diplomatic efforts behind the scenes to convince the Soviets to accept the U.S. proposal. As the diplomatic efforts continued, Kennedy and Khrushchev engaged in a series of secret exchanges, using back channels to communicate directly with each other. The two leaders discussed the details of the proposed agreement, including the timing and verification of the missile removals. They also explored ways to reduce tensions and improve relations between their countries, including the possibility of a summit meeting to discuss areas of common interest. On November 3, 1962, Khrushchev sent a letter to Kennedy in which he accepted the U.S. proposal to dismantle and remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for a U.S. pledge not to invade the island. The Soviet leader also agreed to allow UN inspectors to verify the removal of the missiles, provided that the United States would lift its naval blockade of Cuba. Kennedy, relieved that a breakthrough had been achieved, quickly accepted Khrushchev's terms, and the two sides began to make arrangements for the implementation of the agreement. As the agreement was finalized, Kennedy and Khrushchev began to work out the details of the missile removals. The Soviet Union would dismantle and remove all nuclear-armed ballistic missiles from Cuba, as well as their associated support equipment and personnel. In return, the United States would lift its naval quarantine of the island and provide a public guarantee that it would not invade Cuba. The two sides also agreed to establish a system for verifying the removal of the missiles, which would be overseen by the United Nations. To facilitate the verification process, the United Nations Secretary-General, UNT, was asked to dispatch a team of inspectors to Cuba to monitor the dismantling and removal of the missiles. The team, led by Swedish diplomat Gunnar Jarring, arrived in Havana on November 5, 1962, and immediately began working with Soviet and Cuban officials to implement the agreement. Meanwhile, back in Washington, Kennedy's advisors were working to ensure that the U.S. military was prepared to respond quickly in case the Soviets attempted to renege on their commitment. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara ordered the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff to maintain a high state of alert, with troops and equipment ready to be deployed to Cuba at a moment's notice. As the days passed, the Soviet Union began to make good on its promise to remove the missiles from Cuba. On November 7, 1962, the first shipment of missile components left the port of Mariel, bound for the Soviet Union. Over the next several weeks, more shipments followed, with the Soviets working diligently to dismantle and remove all of the nuclear-armed ballistic missiles from the island. Despite the progress being made, there were still many challenges to overcome. The Cubans, who had been largely excluded from the negotiations between Kennedy and Khrushchev, were growing increasingly frustrated with the terms of the agreement. Fidel Castro, the Cuban leader, was particularly incensed by the U.S. demand that the Soviets remove all of their military personnel from the island, which he saw as a betrayal of Cuba's sovereignty. As tensions began to rise between Cuba and the Soviet Union, Kennedy's advisors grew concerned that the agreement might still unravel. In an effort to calm the situation, Kennedy dispatched a team of diplomats, led by U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Adlai Stevenson, to Havana to meet with Castro and reassure him that the U.S. was committed to upholding its end of the bargain. The meeting between Stevenson and Castro took place on November 15, 1962, at the Cuban leader's residence in Havana. The two men engaged in a tense and sometimes heated discussion, with Castro expressing his deep disappointment and frustration with the terms of the agreement. Despite the challenges, however, Stevenson was able to reassure Castro that the U.S. was committed to avoiding any further confrontation with Cuba, and that it would work to establish a more positive relationship with the island nation in the future. As the talks between Stevenson and Castro continued, Kennedy's advisors were working behind the scenes to address another critical issue: the presence of Soviet Il-28 bombers in Cuba. The U.S. had long been concerned about the potential threat posed by these aircraft, which were capable of delivering nuclear bombs against American cities. In an effort to resolve this issue, Kennedy's Secretary of State, Dean Rusk engaged in a series of intense negotiations with his Soviet counterpart, Andrei Gromyko. As Rusk and Gromyko delved deeper into negotiations, they began to discuss the specifics of removing the Il-28 bombers from Cuba. The Soviet Union had initially refused to include these aircraft in the agreement, citing their role as defensive weapons. However, Kennedy's administration remained adamant that the presence of these bombers posed a significant threat to American national security. To address this concern, Rusk proposed a compromise. The Soviet Union would agree to remove the Il-28 bombers from Cuba, but only if the United States would provide a public assurance that it would not invade the island. Gromyko, after consulting with Khrushchev, agreed to this proposal in principle, but insisted that the wording of the assurance be carefully crafted to avoid any implication of weakness or appeasement. As the negotiations continued, Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General and brother of the President, played a key role in drafting the language of the assurance. He worked closely with Rusk and other administration officials to craft a statement that would satisfy Soviet concerns while also addressing American security needs. This development marked a significant milestone in the resolution of the crisis, as it effectively eliminated the threat posed by these aircraft. As the bombers were dismantled and prepared for shipment back to the Soviet Union, American reconnaissance planes continued to monitor the situation closely, ensuring that all parties complied with the terms of the agreement. Meanwhile, Fidel Castro remained skeptical of the deal, fearing that the removal of the Il-28 bombers would leave Cuba vulnerable to American aggression. In a series of tense meetings with Soviet officials, Castro expressed his disappointment and frustration with the terms of the agreement. Andrei Gromyko, who had traveled to Havana to reassure Castro of Soviet support, found himself facing a difficult task in calming the Cuban leader's concerns. As tensions between Cuba and the Soviet Union continued to simmer, Kennedy's administration began to focus on the next phase of the crisis, verifying the removal of all Soviet military personnel and equipment from the island. To facilitate this process, the United States and the Soviet Union agreed to establish a joint commission which would oversee the dismantling and removal of all Soviet military installations in Cuba. The commission, which was chaired by U Thant, the Secretary General of the United Nations, began its work on November 25, 1962. Over the next several weeks, the commission's inspectors worked tirelessly to verify the removal of all Soviet military equipment from Cuba, including missiles, bombers, and support personnel. As the inspection process progressed, Kennedy's administration remained vigilant, recognizing that the crisis was far from over. In Washington, Robert McNamara and other senior officials continued to monitor the situation closely, ready to respond quickly in case of any signs of Soviet backsliding or Cuban non-compliance. The atmosphere remained tense, with many officials aware that a single misstep could still plunge the world into chaos. As the days turned into weeks, however, it became increasingly clear that the worst of the crisis had passed, and that a fragile peace was beginning to take hold. As the year drew to a close, Kennedy's administration began to reflect on the lessons learned from the Cuban Missile Crisis. The near disaster had highlighted the importance of diplomacy, communication, and careful planning in preventing catastrophic conflicts. It had also underscored the need for American leaders to remain vigilant and adaptable in the face of rapidly changing global events. The Cuban Missile Crisis will forever be etched in the annals of history as a stark reminder of the devastating consequences of unchecked aggression and the transformative power of diplomacy. This pivotal moment in human history brought the world to the brink of nuclear war, only to be pulled back from the edge by the courageous leadership of a few individuals who chose dialogue over destruction. Thank you for joining me throughout this historical journey. That's all for today's History with Herodotus. Remember to like, share, and subscribe. And until next time, remember that, to understand the present, we must first understand the past.